100 guns. That number was stamped into the hull of HMS Victory before she ever fired a single shot in anger. And every pirate captain in the Atlantic already knew what it meant. Here is the strange part. Pirates were not cowards. They took on merchant convoys, colonial forts, even small naval frigates. So why, in the entire golden age of piracy, is there almost no recorded case of a pirate crew willingly engaging a first-rate ship of the line? The answer is not simply firepower. It is something stranger, a machine of violence so precisely engineered that the sight of it alone was designed to end a fight before it started. We are going to take that machine apart, piece by piece, and find out exactly what made it the most feared object on the ocean. There is one design feature of the man-of-war that had nothing to do with killing the enemy, and yet sailors considered it the most important thing on the ship. And the single greatest threat to a ship of the line was not a cannonball from an enemy fleet. It was something far closer to home. Picture the most feared pirate of the Golden Age, Edward Teach, Blackbeard, bottling up the entire harbor of Charleston, South Carolina, in the spring of 1718. Multiple vessels seized, a colonial port held hostage. The man had nerve that bordered on a kind of madness, and yet, search the historical record, the prize court documents, the colonial governor's dispatches, Charles Johnson's 1724 account of the pirates, and you will find something conspicuous by its absence. Blackbeard never once trained his guns on a Royal Navy ship of the line. Not one attempt, not even a close call. Neither did Bartholomew Roberts, who took hundreds of prizes across 2 oceans. Neither did Calico Jack, nor any of the major figures of that era. That silence is the clue. Pirates were tactically aggressive, often outnumbering their targets and crew, and perfectly willing to fight when the odds were merely bad. So what made the odds against a man-of-war not just bad, but apparently unthinkable? We are not here simply to catalog a warship. We are here to understand what it was built to project, and why that projection worked, even when the guns were cold and the ship was miles away. If you are finding this useful, a subscribe takes 1 second, and it means the next investigation lands straight in your feed. So here is the first hard piece of evidence, the rating system. The Royal Navy divided its warships into 6 rates, and the number was not a rank of honor, it was a specification. A first rate carried 100 guns or more across 3 gun decks, crewed by 800 men or upward. A second rate, somewhere in the 80s to 90s. A third rate, the true workhorse, carried between 64 and 80 guns, and it became the most produced warship of the 18th century for one precise reason. It balanced firepower against cost almost perfectly. Now here is what matters for our investigation. From roughly 2 miles out, any captain alive could read a ship's rate from her profile alone. The number of gun ports cut into her sides, the height of her freeboard, the spread of her decks. The rating system made a man-of-war instantly legible at distance. You did not need to close to pistol range to understand what you were facing. That legibility was itself a weapon. A pirate sloop sitting low on the water, watching a third-rate 74 resolve out of the morning haze, did not need to count the guns one by one. The silhouette said everything. And the mathematics it implied, weight of broadside, depth of hull, size of crew, were not numbers a pirate captain needed to work through slowly. The answer arrived before the ship did. That silhouette carried a promise, and the hull was what backed it up. Picture the cross-section of a third-rate side at the waterline. English oak planking laid in overlapping courses, the inner and outer skins separated by heavy framing timbers, the total thickness running close to 2 feet in the most exposed sections. The Navy Board surveyors specified every one of those dimensions in documents called Scantlings, precise timber measurements dictating exactly how thick each structural member had to be, how closely the frames were to be spaced, which grades of oak from which English counties were acceptable. Nothing was left to a shipwright's instinct. The geometry mattered as much as the mass. The frames were angled and layered so that an impact force didn't punch straight through. It spread laterally across multiple members, dissipating before it reached anything vital. Now consider what a pirate sloop was typically throwing at that wall. A 4-pound or 6-pound shot. Against standard merchant planking, those balls punched clean holes and scattered lethal splinters. Against a ship-of-the-line Scantlings, they buried themselves in the outer skin and stopped. Expensive noise, fired at expensive timber. The hull was not passive protection. It was a standing counter-argument to every gun a pirate could realistically carry, and it had been making that argument since the keel was laid. That 2-foot oak wall stopped the shot. What came next decided what happened to the ship that fired it. A first-rate carried 3 full gun decks stacked above the waterline. The lowest tier held the heaviest ordnance the age produced, 32-pounders, and on some earlier first-rates, 42-pounders, each cannon running close to 10 feet in length and weighing somewhere between 2 and 3 tons. The middle deck stepped down to 18 and 24-pounders. The upper deck carried 12s. That stagger was not accidental. Each tier could engage a different target at a different range simultaneously. The lower deck hammering a hull at close quarters, while the upper deck swept a second vessel further off. The lower deck guns alone, in a single broadside, threw more iron than most pirate sloops carried in their entire powder room from one voyage to the next. Add the full 3 decks together, and a first-rate's broadside delivered roughly 1,200 pounds of iron in one salvo. One salvo. A 4-gun sloop might answer with 40 pounds if everything fired cleanly. There was one constraint worth noting. In heavy weather, the lower gun ports sat close enough to the waterline that opening them risked flooding the deck entirely. The ports were sealed, the lower tier went silent, and the ship fought on 2 decks instead of 3. Even reduced, it was more than enough. Guns, crew, or hull, which do you think made the man of war truly unstoppable? Drop your answer below. But here is what they don't tell you. The oak and the iron only explain half the terror. Pirates who'd watched a third-rate work a broadside knew the weight of that salvo. Over 600 pounds of iron, gone in under 3 seconds. They knew the math. Some still came. What stopped them wasn't the guns. It was the 800 people behind those guns, moving like a single mechanism. And understanding that mechanism changes everything you think you know about why the man of war was truly feared. 800 men, on some first rates closer to 850. That number needs a moment to land. Some colonial settlements on the American eastern seaboard in the early 18th century held fewer people than a single warship's roster. But the raw head count is almost beside the point. What mattered was the architecture behind it. The crew was divided into watches, so that roughly half the men were always on duty, regardless of the hour. Within those watches, every sailor was assigned to a specific gun crew, typically 6 to 14 men per cannon, each with a named role: loader, rammer, sponger, powder carrier, the man who managed the vent. Nobody improvised. Nobody wandered. Drill reduced the loading cycle to under 90 seconds per gun. Run out, fire, sponge the barrel to kill any remaining spark, ram the cartridge, ball, and wad home, run out again. 90 seconds. On a gun deck of 30 cannon working in sequence, that rhythm produced a near continuous roll of fire rather than a single punch. A pirate sloop with 80 men couldn't approach that tempo. Take casualties and the gun crews thin out. The rhythm collapses. On a man of war, a gun crew could lose 2 men and the remaining 4 kept the cycle running. Slower, but running. The pirates didn't just face more iron. They faced a machine that kept producing it after taking hits they couldn't survive themselves. That relentless gun deck rhythm solved one problem, keeping iron moving outward. But what happened when the enemy came inboard? A boarding action was the pirates' entire playbook. Close fast, hook on, swarm the deck before the defenders could organize. Against a merchant crew of 20, it worked almost every time. Against a man of war, it ran directly into a separate body of soldiers who existed for no other purpose. The Marines, tracing back to the Admiral's regiment of the 1660s, were not sailors. They didn't work the rigging or the guns. They were stationed in the fighting tops, the platforms bolted to the masts roughly 50 to 60 feet above the waterline, armed with muskets and a clear, plunging angle onto any vessel that came alongside. A pirate scrambling up a hull or crowding the rail below was exposed from above, no cover, nowhere to go. That elevation wasn't incidental. A musket ball fired downward at close range carries a different geometry of damage than one fired horizontally. The tops turned the boarding party's own momentum into a liability. At Trafalgar, a Marine sharpshooter in the tops of HMS Victory shot Admiral Nelson from the French ship Redoutable alongside. Roughly 65 feet of vertical distance, point-blank range in fleet terms. The same position that protected a man of war from pirates was lethal enough to kill the most celebrated admiral in the Royal Navy. The pirates' fastest weapon, speed and chaos, was answered by men who had been waiting, still and elevated, for exactly that moment. The boarding threat was solved. But what actually ended a pirate chase? Most people picture that 32-pound iron ball punching clean through a hull. And yes, it could, but the shot that genuinely decided encounters at sea was lighter, stranger, and far more deliberate. Chain shot. 2 iron balls joined by a length of chain, maybe 18 inches end to end when taut, tumbling through the air in a flat, scything arc. Bar shot worked the same principle. 2 half balls on a solid iron rod. And then there was langrage, scrap iron, bolt heads, broken tools, packed into a canvas bag that burst apart at the muzzle like a horizontal hailstorm. None of these were aimed at the hull. They were aimed at the rigging, the ropes, the canvas, the masts. A pirate vessel's entire survival logic was mobility. If you couldn't outgun a man of war, you outran it, or you closed so fast the range advantage collapsed. One well-aimed chain-shot broadside that brought down a foremast removed that calculation entirely. The sloop sat dead in the water. No flight, no closing speed, no options. Just the man of war working upwind at its own pace, reloading. The most feared weapon aboard wasn't the one that sank you. It was the one that made sure you stayed to watch what came next. The most counterintuitive part of this whole story is still ahead. Subscribe now so you do not miss the reveal. First rate, second rate, or third rate? Which rating would you want to sail on? Guess before we get there. Chain shot immobilized a pirate vessel. But what kept a man of war fast enough to run one down in the first place? By the 1760s, the Royal Navy had begun sheathing the underwater hulls of ships of the line in thin copper plates, each roughly 4 feet long, and fixed with copper nails to prevent galvanic corrosion where dissimilar metals meet seawater. The problem it solved was unglamorous, but lethal to performance: marine fouling. Left unprotected, a wooden hull below the waterline accumulates barnacles within weeks, and shipworm, Teredo nivalis, a pale, finger-length mollusk that bores tunnels through oak, within months. A heavily fouled hull could lose a third of its sailing speed, and required careening, hauling the ship onto its side on a beach to scrape and burn the bottom clean. That process took weeks and left a warship completely vulnerable. A copper-sheathed hull resisted both. The copper oxidized into a thin, toxic layer that barnacles and worm could not grip. A man of war coppered in port could stay on station for a year or more without meaningful speed loss. Naval architects of the period considered it the single most operationally decisive improvement of the era, more valuable, ship for ship, than adding guns. A pirate sloop that had been at sea for 6 months was already slower than it left port. The ship hunting it had barely slowed at all. Now the real contradiction. We have mapped the weapon down to its copper skin, but a man of war at anchor is just expensive timber. Keeping dozens of them at sea, simultaneously, across 3 oceans, required a supply chain so vast that at its peak it employed more workers than any single industry in Britain. And when that chain broke, just once, in 1797, over 100 guns went silent without a single enemy shot fired. That supply chain the previous beat hinted at is almost impossible to picture until you start counting trees. A single first-rate ship of the line consumed roughly 6,000 mature oaks in its construction, trees that had been growing for a century or more, covering something close to 100 acres of forest. And that was one hull, once. The Royal Navy was running dozens simultaneously. The dockyards at Portsmouth, Plymouth, and Chatham were, by any honest measure, the largest industrial complexes in the 18th century world. Thousands of shipwrights, rope makers, caulkers, and riggers worked inside them in shifts. The rope walk at Portsmouth stretched more than 1,000 feet, longer than many village high streets, just to twist hemp into cable thick enough to hold an anchor. That hemp came from Russia. Mast timber, the long, straight-grained stuff a British oak could never provide, came from the Baltic. Tar and pitch for waterproofing the seams arrived from Scandinavia and the American colonies. A man of war was not, in any meaningful sense, a British object. It was a global supply chain pressed into a hull, which made it fragile in a way no enemy broadside could easily replicate. During the American Revolution, Baltic trade routes tightened, and American naval stores dried up almost overnight. The disruption slowed construction and repair faster than any fleet action had managed. 6,000 trees, 4 continents, and 1 severed trade agreement, and the guns went quiet. The supply chain that built the ship had a human equivalent, and it was just as coercive. The impress service operated with blunt legal authority. Any able-bodied man between 18 and 55 with sea experience could be seized. Press gangs worked the docksides, the taverns, the roads leading out of coastal towns. Merchant sailors were boarded mid-voyage and dragged across to a receiving ship before their own crew could protest. A man could be eating supper in Portsmouth on a Tuesday and standing a watch in the Channel by Thursday, with no word sent home, no fixed discharge date, and no meaningful right of refusal. Aboard, the Articles of War governed everything. 12 offenses carried the death penalty. Flogging was administered in front of the assembled crew, a deliberate public ritual, not a private punishment. Desertion rates ran high enough that some ships confined pressed men below decks in harbor, specifically to prevent it. And yet under fire, these same men loaded and ran out guns with a rhythm that professional soldiers watching from the quarterdeck described as almost mechanical in its steadiness. That discipline wasn't born from loyalty. It was built from repetition so relentless that the body stopped needing the mind's permission, which tells you something cold about what the man of war actually was. A machine that processed human beings the same way it processed timber and hemp, and expected the same output. Disease or cannon fire, which do you think killed more Royal Navy sailors? Answer below, we reveal it at the end. That mechanical steadiness had a purpose beyond survival. It was the engine of a tactic that made the man of war nearly impossible to fight on equal terms. The line of battle was exactly what it sounds like. Every ship sailing in a single column, one behind the other, each vessel's broadside pointing outward. The geometry solved a brutal problem. Fire your guns from a cluster and you hit your own ships. Stretch into a line and every crew can shoot freely, simultaneously, without a friendly hull in the way. Simple to describe, agonizing to execute. Maintaining station under fire meant reading flag signals through gun smoke, adjusting sail trim while the deck lurched from incoming shot, and holding your nerve as the ship ahead of you vanished behind a wall of gray haze. Captains drilled their crews for months before a fleet action, because a gap of even a few hundred yards in the line handed the enemy a way through. And that is the clue this tactic leaves about pirates. To fight in line, you need multiple large ships, a shared command structure, and crews trained to hold formation while being killed. Pirates had none of these. No fleet, no flag signals, no institutional memory passed down through years of service. The line of battle wasn't just a tactic. It was a certificate of statehood, and it could not be forged. What made the line of battle so suffocating for pirates wasn't only the guns. It was something older and quieter, built into the institution itself. Royal Navy captains operated under what their own articles called a duty to engage. Fail to fight when you could, and you faced a court-martial. Not a reprimand, a trial, public disgrace, potentially death. Admiral Byng was shot on his own quarterdeck in 1757 for doing exactly that, pulling back when he might have pressed. Every officer in the fleet knew his name afterward. That precedent removed every variable a pirate captain normally worked with. Hesitation, gone. The possibility of a bribe, gone. The hope that the warship's captain might calculate the risk and decide it wasn't worth it, gone. The man of war would come, always. The institution had engineered certainty into the encounter before a single gun was run out. Blackbeard understood this. He raided coastlines, took merchant prizes, blockaded Charlestown Harbor, but he never once stood to fight a raided warship. That wasn't timidity. It was a precise reading of a system that had deliberately removed all the exits. The terror wasn't the broadside. It was knowing there was no version of this where they turn around. But the institution's certainty had a seam in it, and in the spring of 1797, that seam split open. The Channel Fleet, anchored at Spithead, simply refused to sail. Not one ship, the whole fleet. Sailors elected delegates, lowered officers over the side in some cases, and held the most powerful naval force in the world in harbor for roughly 6 weeks. When the Nore anchorage followed, the blockade of the Thames became a genuine possibility. Their grievances were not abstract. Pay for an ordinary seaman had not been raised since the reign of Charles II, nearly a century and a half earlier. Food was short-weighted by pursers who pocketed the difference. Sick men were docked wages while they lay below. These were the human beings who loaded the guns, worked the pumps, and held the line. The government capitulated on most demands at Spithead. The Nore ringleaders were hanged, Richard Parker among them, tried and executed within weeks. But the pay increase stood. That is the clue this episode leaves. Every detail uncovered so far, the copper sheathing, the gun deck geometry, the Marines, the logistics empire, was inert without men willing to work it. The man of war did not run on oak. It ran on a willingness the Navy had been quietly spending down for 150 years. So here is what all of it was actually about. The copper sheathing, the damage control pumps, the shot plugs stacked beside every gun. None of those features were designed to kill anyone. They were designed to keep the ship present, and the sailors who worked them were not confused about the priority. Crews and naval architects of the period were explicit. The ability to absorb punishment and hold station was worth more than any additional battery. A ship that could not be sunk could not be beaten. That endurance, not the broadside, was what they called the most important thing aboard. The gun's deadliest rival was never another fleet. Typhus and scurvy killed more Royal Navy sailors throughout the Age of Sail than all enemy action combined. A first-rate could lose a third of her complement to sickness before sighting a hostile coast, which is why the reforms that ultimately preserved the most fighting power were not new gun designs or improved powder charges. They were lemon juice contracts, hospital ships, and victualling inspectors with the authority to reject short-weighted barrels. Unglamorous, bureaucratic, and more decisive to British sea power than anything that happened at the gun deck. That is the answer to what a pirate actually feared. Not 100 guns. The answer to the question of how those guns got there and kept firing. 6,000 trees. 4 continents. A legal code that could hang a man within weeks. Press gangs, dockyards, supply chains, lemon juice, and underneath all of it, the 1797 mutineers at Spithead, who proved that the whole apparatus, copper, oak, artillery, empire, was inert without the men willing to work it. A pirate crew could match a brave sailor. They could not replicate a state that had learned, at enormous cost, how to keep its sailors alive long enough to fight. HMS Victory's guns were the symptom. The empire of logistics, medicine, and institutional memory behind them was the disease, and there was no running from that. So here is the question I want you to sit with. Was the man of war the greatest weapon ever built, or the most expensive way a government ever told its own sailors they were expendable? The answer probably depends on which end of the cannon you were standing. Drop your take below. If this investigation earned a subscribe,